Thank you, Penina. Thanks to everyone coming out tonight. And to my fellow readers, and my apologies once again for arriving too late. I'm sorry I flew in, I got hysterical and lost and wandering around Manhattan. My trilogy of novels is about two characters. One of them is called Lars. He shares his first name with me. Another one is called W. And W may well resemble a friend of mine whose name actually begins with W. So these three novels see these two would-be philosophers wandering, and this is a theme of the evening, wandering through a landscape of education, of universities, which is marked by total devastation and horror. These two characters then are wandering around in a state of horror, in a state of, for them, the end of times is at hand. W resorts in these terrible times to insulting Lars, the character Lars, and Lars resorts in these end of times to narrating W's insults of him, i.e. Lars. We start my reading tonight from Exodus, the final volume in the trilogy. We start in a hotel room where W is once again sitting upon what he calls the chair of judgment. And the chair of judgment is that place where he sits when he thinks that Lars needs the full weight of his W's judgment. My hotel room. W takes his seat once again on the chair of judgment. It's time to list my shortcomings. It's time to examine where I've gone wrong, to bury down to the root cause. Would you call yourself a moral man? W asks. Would you call yourself a man of honor? Do other people look up to you? Are other people moved by you, inspired by you? A pause. And then, do you think you've touched other people's lives in a good way? Do you see yourself as a man of thought, a man of profundity, a man who will leave a legacy? These are the questions which constantly circle in W's head, as he knows that they do not circle in mine, he says. How do you think you'll be judged? W asks. As a serious man? As a man attuned to what matters most? And then? Will you be remembered as a great soul? As a spiritual leader? A pause. And then? How do you understand your failure? Who do you measure yourself against? What standards have you failed to meet? Gin, W demands. He wants a respite from his judgment. W is soothed by the Plymouth Gin botanicals. He can taste the orris root and the coriander seeds. He can taste the orange peel. Plymouth Gin is our Realitätpunkt, W says. Our rallying point, our place of safety. Sipping Plymouth Gin is always a homecoming, W says. A return to what is most important. If only we had some vermouth, we could make martinis, W says. In the Plymouth Gin cocktail bar, they swill your glass with vermouth, specially imported from America, then they pour it straight out. Only then do they fill the glass with Plymouth Gin and add a spiral of lemon peel, W says. You need vermouth only to pour it away, like an offering made to the gods, W says. More questions. How many people do you think you've offended? W asks. How many people have you irritated? Have you angered? How many people have tried to sue you? Because he knows that some have. How many people have tried to run you out of town? W begins again. How many appetites have you spoilt? How many people have you put off their dinner? What would you say is your most irritating trait? Your most rage-inducing one? And then, what do you think your clothes say about you? And your hair, your shoes? Does the way you dress befit your role as a would-be thinker? As a would-be philosopher? Still more questions. Do you think you have a noble face? A dignified bearing? Do you think you have the physiognomy of a thinker? An intelligent face? Do your rolls of fat make you uncomfortable? Do you think obesity gives you gravitas? Presence? He pauses. At what stage would you consider gastric bypass surgery? Have you ever thought of liposuction? Do you think you come across as a happy fat man or as a sad fat man? At what stage will you have your mouth sewn up? Of what are you most guilty, W asks. What is your greatest source of shame? What is your greatest failing? Do you think you failed? Do you think you should be ashamed? Do you have any real sense of guilt? And then, what do you think you add to the world? W asks. What do you think you subtract? What is your net worth to existence? Do you think you've added to the balance of goodness in the cosmos or of evil? Are you on the side of angels or the devils? How do you think you can make amends? W asks. Do you think you can make amends? How do you think you can make reparations for damages to intellectual reputation, for emotional damage, for digestive damage? Where do you think you stand in the great chain of thinkers? W asks. With what historical figure do you identify? What philosophical figure? How would you rank yourself in a list of contemporary philosophers? And then, do you think you've understood your time, brought it to expression in some way? Are you a diagnoser of your times or a symptom of your times? Are you a cultural physician or a cultural patient? W's exhausted, he says. The judgment is nearly over. A final round. Do you think you fool people? W asks. Can others read your stupidity in your eyes, do you think? Can they see your idiocy in your gait, your posture? And then, do you think you have a real sense of your idiocy Do you grasp just how desperately you've fallen short? Dawn, daylight behind the blinds. The judgment's over. W reads out a passage from Kierkegaard, which he copied into his notebook. What does God want? He wants souls able to praise, adore, worship, and thank him, the business of angels. And what pleases him even more than the praise of angels is a human being who, in the last lap of his life, when God seemingly changes into sheer cruelty, nevertheless continues to believe that God is love, that God does it out of love. If he's cruel to me, it's out of love, W says. It's meant as the highest kindness. When he sits on the chair of judgment, exploring the many compromises of my life, my betrayals and half measures, who else would have taken notice? Who else would have tried to teach me the meaning of sin? Ah, would that he had had a similar tutor. Would that someone had had the same interest in him. But perhaps my ingratitude is for W only a version of God's cruelty. Perhaps my moaning and protest, as he sits above me on the chair of judgment, is only a way for God to test the extremity of W's love. That's W and Lars in a hotel bedroom. Not at all modelled on life, I can promise you. Not at all. W views himself as being part of a legendary generation of philosophers. These great philosophers came from a university, the University of Essex, which in the UK is known for being very marginal, very 60s. It's not like the other universities in the UK built in the Victorian period or before the Victorian period. The University of Essex is known in the UK for being very political. Well, as part of their wanderings through the neoliberal horror that is Britain, W and Lars venture to visit W's alma mater, the great, the fabled University of Essex. Essex Student Union Bar. This is where he used to drink as a postgraduate, W says. It's where he learned to drink. He who had been near teetotal before. And to smoke, he who had never smoked a cigarette in his life. Do I have any sense of what it was like to feel part of a generation, W says? Can I understand what it was to have something expected of you, to have faith placed in you? A sense that something was happening, something that could only have happened there and then. Did they think they could change the world, I asked him. Not the world, but thought, W says. They believed that they could change thinking, that they were the beginning of something, a new movement, that they augured what Britain might become, a thinking country, just as France is a thinking country, just as Germany once was a thinking country. This is where they spoke, W says, and of great things. This is where they spoke. Can I understand what that means? To speak, to be swept along by great currents, to be borne along, part of something, some ongoing debate, and for that debate to have stakes, to matter, for thought to become personal, to concern the most intimate details of your life. Ah, how can he convey it to me who has never known intellectual life? Intellectual friendship, who barely knows what friendship means, let alone the intellect. A life of the mind, that's what they'd chosen. A life of the mind for postgraduates, for graduate students from all over Britain. A kind of internal exile. Because that's what it means to be a thinker in Britain. A kind of internal exile. They'd turned their backs on their families, on old friends, on the places of their birth. They turned from their old lives, their old jobs, old lovers. They travelled from the four corners of the country to be remade here, to be reborn. Essex, Essex, what joy it was in that dawn to be alive. This is where they spoke, says W, very insistently. Do I know what it means to speak? This is where they argued. Do I know what it means to argue? This is where they fought in thought. And this is where they loved too, says W. The Student Union Bar, this was where thought was alive. Where thought was life, where thought was a matter of life and death. This is where they spoke, W says. Where voices trembled, where voices rose. They laughed, and the laughter died away. Did they weep? No doubt there was weeping. No doubt some wept. This is where they promised themselves to thought. This is where they signed the covenant. It was like serving together in a secret army, W says. Even now, when he meets them, the former postgraduates of Essex, he sees the sign. Even now, it's clear. They are marked. They were marked then. Thought was life. Thought was their lives. They were remade in thought's crucible. They flared up, renewed from thought's fire. They learned to read French thought in French, German thought in German. They studied Latin and ancient Greek. Imagine it, a British person reading ancient Greek. They crossed the Channel and studied in Paris. They plunged into Europe and studied in Rome. They visited the great archives. They read in the great libraries. They were becoming European, W says. Do I have any idea what that meant, to become European? Some of them even learned to speak other languages. Imagine it, a British person speaking French. Imagine it, a Briton in Berlin conversing in German. They went en masse to a 2-week conference in Italy. Imagine it, British postgraduates en masse at a 2-week conference in Italy. They played chess in the sun and drank wine until their teeth turned red. Italy, the Mediterranean! Who among them had ever been to Italy or the Mediterranean? Who had any idea of Italy or the Mediterranean? The sun burned them brown. Imagine their pallid British bodies brown, their teeth red. The sun turned them mad. They thought as Van Gogh painted, without a hat and in the full sun. Hatless in the full sun they became, mad women and mad men of thought. Essex broke them. Essex rebuilt them. Essex broke their Britishness, their provincialness. Essex gave them philosophy. It gave them friendship. And by way of philosophy, by way of politics, they were close to Europe, terribly close. Like Hullin's Greece, Europe was the fire from heaven for the Essex postgraduate. Like Hullin's Germany, Britain, staid and dull, was to be set on fire by heaven. Ah, what happened to them all, the postgraduates of Essex? W. Muses. What happened to the last generation of Essex postgraduates? Some escaped, some wandered, some went elsewhere, but others fell back into Britishness, fell into the drowning pool of Britishness. They drowned, gasping for air, finding no air in Britain. Had they seen too much? Had they learnt what they lacked? Hadn't they a sense now of great thought, of great politics? Hadn't their skies been full of light, full of the heavenly fire? Thank you.